With barely $4,000 in a hidden savings account, Lila Chun is counting down the days until she can disappear from her abusive ex-boyfriend Derek until a mysterious Korean crime boss named Kim Jae-won steps into her world. He notices the way she flinches when Derek unexpectedly appears at her restaurant, sees the finger-shaped bruises she tries to hide, and recognizes the desperation of a woman running out of time and options. At 23, Lila balanced elegant dinner trays with the relentless demands of saving every possible dollar toward her escape fund. She was practical, focused, and intimately familiar with the weight of every coin that stood between her and freedom. Her natural hair was styled in a protective twist-out that caught the warm restaurant lighting even during the busiest dinner rush, and her tall, graceful frame moved through the upscale dining room with practiced efficiency despite the exhaustion that seemed to live permanently behind her determined brown eyes. She had exactly $4,200 saved toward the $6,000 she needed to vanish completely, to start over somewhere Derek could never find her. The Metropolitan Grill catered to Seoul's wealthy elite, the kind of establishment where a single bottle of wine cost more than most people made in a week, where conversations were conducted in hushed tones about business deals worth millions, and where Lila's service was expected to be invisible, professional, and flawless. She had worked here for 8 months, ever since arriving in Seoul with dreams of teaching English and exploring a new culture, dreams that had quickly turned into a nightmare when Derek's charming facade had cracked to reveal the monster underneath. The dinner rush was in full swing when she first noticed him. Table 12 held a single customer, a Korean man in his mid-30s dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that was perfectly tailored to his lean, powerful frame. The fabric looked Italian, probably cost more than her entire savings account, and it fit him with the kind of precision that spoke of custom work and unlimited resources. He had sharp, almost architectural features, dark hair swept back from his forehead, and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to control. Kim Jae-won, according to the reservation, though she suspected that wasn't the name on his identification. He ordered simply, black coffee and the evening special, but there was nothing simple about his presence. He commanded attention without demanding it, created a subtle gravity that made other diners lower their voices when passing his table, made the seasoned waitstaff move with extra care in his vicinity. Lila had served enough powerful men to recognize danger wrapped in expensive clothing, and everything about this man radiated a controlled intensity that made her hyper-aware of her own movements. She approached his table with professional composure, notepad ready, but found herself momentarily disarmed by the directness of his gaze. His eyes were dark, penetrating, and held an intelligence that seemed to see far more than she was comfortable revealing. "What can I get you this evening?" she asked, her voice steady despite the strange flutter of nervousness in her chest. "The special looks excellent," he replied, his English perfect and accented with the precision of someone who had learned the language through formal education rather than casual conversation. "And coffee, black." "Certainly, sir. Is there anything else I can bring you?" "Just your name," he said, and the request was delivered with such casual authority that she answered before thinking. "Lila." "Lila," he repeated, as if testing the weight of it. "I'm Kim Jae-won." She nodded, uncertain why he was sharing this information, uncomfortable with the intensity of his attention. Most wealthy customers barely acknowledged her existence beyond the necessity of placing their orders. This man studied her face as if memorizing it, noticed details she hoped no one would see. The evening progressed normally for another hour, Lila moving between tables with practiced efficiency, Jae-won dining in solitude while conducting what appeared to be business calls in rapid Korean. She was clearing nearby tables when the restaurant's front door opened and her entire world tilted sideways. Derek walked in. The sight of him hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and sending her heart into a frantic rhythm that made her dizzy. He wasn't supposed to be here. Wasn't supposed to know where she worked. The restaurant was across town from their old neighborhood, in a district where he had no business, no connections, no reason to be. But there he was, scanning the dining room with predatory intent, looking for her. Lila set down the water glasses she'd been carrying before her trembling hands could drop them. She turned away from the entrance, hoping the low lighting and her position behind a partition would keep her hidden. But Derek's voice carried across the quiet restaurant like a threat. "Lila, I know you're here. I can see your fucking purse behind the hostess stand." The words were loud enough to make nearby diners pause their conversations, crude enough to make the hostess step backward in alarm. Lila's blood turned to ice. Her purse. He recognized her purse, which meant he'd been watching, waiting, learning her patterns. The thought of him observing her from the shadows made her skin crawl with revulsion and terror. She forced herself to move, to walk toward the front of the restaurant, where Derek waited with barely contained rage radiating from his 6-foot frame. He was still handsome in the conventional sense, the kind of looks that had initially attracted her before she'd learned what lay beneath the surface. Blonde hair, blue eyes, the build of someone who spent serious time in the gym. But now all she could see was the potential for violence in his stance, the possessiveness that had gradually revealed itself as control, manipulation, and eventually physical abuse. "Derek," she said quietly, hoping to keep the conversation private. "What are you doing here?" "What do you think I'm doing here?" he replied, his voice carrying easily across the restaurant. "I'm here for my girlfriend who seems to think she can just disappear without talking to me. We broke up, Derek. 3 months ago. We had a fight," he corrected, stepping closer until she had to resist the urge to back away. "That doesn't mean anything's over between us. You're being dramatic." Lila was acutely aware of the other customers watching this scene unfold, of her professional reputation crumbling as Derek's voice grew louder and more aggressive. The Metropolitan Grill prided itself on discretion and elegance, and this confrontation was exactly the kind of scene that could cost her the job she desperately needed. "You need to leave," she said, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her veins. "This is my workplace. I'll leave when you come home with me," Derek replied, and his hand shot out to grab her wrist with enough force to make her gasp in pain. His fingers found the exact spots where previous bruises had faded, as if his grip had muscle memory for causing her hurt. That was when she became aware of movement behind her, a presence that seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the restaurant. Kim Jae-won had risen from his table and was approaching with the kind of measured steps that suggested absolute confidence in his ability to handle any situation that might arise. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying easily, but remaining conversational rather than confrontational. "I believe the lady asked you to leave." Derek turned toward this interruption with irritation that quickly shifted to wariness as he took in Jae-won's appearance. The expensive suit, the controlled intensity, the unmistakable aura of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This is none of your business," Derek said, but some of the aggression had leaked out of his voice, replaced by uncertainty. "Actually," Jae-won replied, his tone remaining pleasant while his dark eyes fixed on Derek with laser focus, "I'm making it my business. The lady is clearly uncomfortable. You're disturbing other guests. I suggest you leave now." There was something in the way he spoke, a quiet authority that made Derek's grip on Lila's wrist loosen involuntarily. This was not a man who made suggestions he didn't expect to be followed. This was someone who commanded respect through presence alone, who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve. "Who the fuck are you?" Derek demanded, but the profanity sounded hollow, desperate rather than threatening. "Someone who doesn't like to see women mistreated," Jae-won answered simply. "Someone who thinks you should reconsider your approach to this conversation." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Lila could feel Derek's rage warring with his growing recognition that he was outmatched, that this stranger represented a level of power and danger he wasn't equipped to challenge. Around them, the restaurant had gone nearly silent, other diners sensing the confrontation without understanding its stakes. "This isn't over," Derek finally said, releasing Lila's wrist and stepping back. "She's my girlfriend. She comes home when she's ready to stop playing games." "She's told you to leave," Jae-won observed, his voice still conversational. "I'd recommend listening." Derek looked between them for another moment, his face cycling through emotions before settling on frustrated defeat. He turned and stalked toward the exit, but paused at the door to call back across the restaurant. "I'll see you soon, Lila. Real soon." Then he was gone, leaving Lila standing beside this mysterious stranger, her wrist throbbing and her professional composure in ruins. She realized she was shaking, adrenaline and fear making her hands tremble visibly. "Thank you," she managed to say, though the words felt inadequate for what had just happened. J1 studied her face with the same intensity he'd shown earlier, but now she understood he was cataloging signs of distress, evidence of a situation far more serious than a simple restaurant disruption. "That's quite a bruise forming on your wrist," he observed quietly. "How long has this been going on?" "I'm fine," Lila replied automatically, the lie so practiced it felt natural. "It's just, we had a difficult breakup." J1's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his dark eyes, a recognition that made her feel simultaneously exposed and understood. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a simple black business card, held it out to her with careful deliberation. "When you're ready to stop handling this alone," he said, his voice carrying weight she didn't fully comprehend, "call me." "Why would you?" she started to ask, then stopped herself. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "Let's just say I have experience with men who hurt women," he replied, his tone suggesting depths of story she couldn't begin to imagine. "And I have resources to make sure they stop permanently." The card felt heavier than it should in her palm, expensive paper stock with nothing but a phone number embossed in silver. No name, no company, no indication of what kind of resources he was referring to, but something about the way he spoke made her believe his offer was completely serious. She should throw it away immediately. This stranger, this intense man who radiated danger and commanded rooms full of Soul's elite, getting involved with him would be stepping from one dangerous situation into another that might be far worse. But she slipped the card into her apron pocket anyway, because Derek's threat had been real, and she was running out of time and options and hope. The next 3 days passed in a haze of anxiety and hypervigilance. Lila found herself checking over her shoulder constantly, studying every face that entered the restaurant, jumping at sudden sounds that reminded her of Derek's voice. The business card remained in her apron pocket, a tangible reminder of the strange encounter, but she couldn't bring herself to use it. Accepting help from Kim Jae-won felt like trading one form of dependence for another, and she had worked too hard for her independence to surrender it now. She was clearing table 7 when Derek appeared again. This time, he didn't enter through the front door like a normal customer. Instead, she glimpsed him through the large windows that faced the street, pacing back and forth on the sidewalk like a predator stalking prey. He wore the same leather jacket she'd bought him for his birthday 6 months ago, back when she'd still believed his promises to change, still thought love could transform his jealousy and possessiveness into something healthy. Her hands trembled as she stacked dishes, the porcelain clinking together with nervous energy. Derek knew her schedule now. Knew she worked Tuesday through Saturday, knew her shift ended at 10:30, knew exactly when she would emerge onto that darkened street. The realization that he'd been watching, learning her patterns, made her skin crawl with revulsion and terror. The restaurant manager, Mrs. Kim, approached with concern creasing her features. "Is everything all right, Lila? You look pale." "I'm fine," she managed to say, though the lie felt transparent. The older woman's sharp eyes missed nothing, especially when it came to her staff's well-being. "If you're having personal troubles," Mrs. Kim said gently, "you know you can speak with me. We protect our employees here." But even as the words were spoken, they both knew the restaurant's protection extended only to the property itself. Once Lila stepped onto the sidewalk, she would be vulnerable, alone, exactly where Derek was waiting. The evening dragged on with excruciating slowness. Each time she glanced toward the windows, Derek was there, sometimes standing still, sometimes pacing, always watching. Other customers began to notice, their conversations growing quieter as they observed the man outside, who seemed fixated on the restaurant's interior. It was nearly 9:30 when Derek finally entered. This time he moved with purpose, bypassing the hostess station entirely and striding directly toward where Lila was serving wine to a table of businessmen. His presence created an immediate disruption in the restaurant's carefully maintained atmosphere, conversations faltering as diners sensed the tension radiating from his aggressive posture. "We need to talk," he announced loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. "Now." "Derek, please," Lila said, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining professionalism while her heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm working. You can't be here." "I can be wherever I want," he replied, and his hand shot out to grip her upper arm with brutal force. His fingers found the exact spot where previous bruises had faded, applying pressure with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to cause pain without leaving immediately visible marks. "You're coming home with me tonight," he continued, his voice carrying easily across the quiet restaurant. "This little game you're playing is over. You don't get to just walk away from us." "There is no us," Lila said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the pain shooting through her arm. "We broke up, Derek. You need to let go of me." "I'm not letting go of anything," he snarled, his grip tightening until she gasped involuntarily. "You're mine, Lila. You've always been mine. And if you think some new job and new friends are going to change that, you're stupider than I thought." The businessmen at her table had stopped pretending to ignore the confrontation. One of them, a distinguished man in his 50s, cleared his throat uncomfortably and addressed Derek directly. "Sir, perhaps you could continue this conversation outside. You're disturbing other guests." Derek turned on him with vicious satisfaction, clearly pleased to have a target for his escalating rage. "Who the fuck asked you, old man? This is between me and my girlfriend." The businessman recoiled, clearly unused to such aggressive confrontation, and Lila felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. Her professional reputation, her standing with customers who had grown to trust and respect her service, was crumbling in real time as Derek's behavior grew more erratic and threatening. "Let me go, Derek," she said, her voice carrying more authority than she felt. "You're making a scene." "Good," he replied with satisfaction. "Maybe if you're embarrassed enough, you'll stop being such a stubborn bitch and come home where you belong." That was when Kim Jae-won stood up. He had been dining at his usual table, conducting business calls in quiet Korean while maintaining his customary awareness of everything happening in his vicinity. But now his attention was completely focused on the confrontation unfolding across the restaurant, and something in his posture had shifted from casual observation to predatory alertness. He approached with measured steps, his expensive shoes making no sound on the restaurant's polished floors, but somehow his presence announced itself before he spoke. Conversations at nearby tables trailed off as diners sensed the change in atmosphere. The way the air itself seemed to thicken with potential violence. "I believe I suggested you leave the other night," Jae-won said, his voice conversational but carrying an undercurrent of menace that made Derek's grip on Lila's arm loosen involuntarily. "I don't like repeating myself." "This is none of your fucking business," Derek replied, but some of the confidence had leaked out of his voice. The profanity that had seemed intimidating when directed at the businessman sounded hollow and desperate when aimed at this controlled, dangerous stranger. "Actually," Jae-won said, moving closer until Derek was forced to crane his neck slightly to maintain eye contact. "It became my business the moment you put your hands on her in my presence. Some things I don't tolerate." Derek studied Jae-won's face, clearly trying to assess the level of threat he was facing. What he saw there must have been unsettling, because his aggressive posture began to deflate, replaced by the wariness of someone who suddenly realized he was outmatched. "She's my girlfriend," Derek said, but the words lacked conviction now. "We're just having a disagreement." "She's asked you to leave," Jae-won observed, his dark eyes never moving from Derek's face. "Multiple times. I'd recommend listening." "Or what?" Derek demanded, trying to reclaim some of his earlier bravado. "What are you going to do about it?" Jae-won smiled then, and it was perhaps the most unsettling expression Lila had ever seen. It didn't reach his eyes, held no warmth or humor, contained only the promise of consequences Derek couldn't begin to imagine. "I think," Jae-won said quietly, "that's a question you really don't want answered." The silence that followed stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Derek looked between Jae-won and Lila, his face cycling through confusion, rage, and growing fear as he began to comprehend that he was facing someone who operated by rules he didn't understand. "This isn't over," Derek finally said, releasing Lila's arm and stepping back. "You can't hide behind him forever, Lila. Sooner or later, you're going to have to face reality." "The reality," Jae-won said, his voice still pleasant but carrying implications that made Derek flinch, "is that you're going to leave now. And you're not going to come back." Derek opened his mouth as if to argue, then seemed to think better of it. He looked at Lila one more time, his expression promising future retribution, then turned and stalked toward the exit. But he paused at the door, unable to resist one final threat. "I know where you live," he called back across the restaurant. "I know your schedule. I know everything about your pathetic little life. You can't avoid me forever." Then he was gone, leaving Lila standing beside J1 with her arm throbbing and her professional composure in complete ruins. She realized she was shaking again, adrenaline making her hands visibly tremble as the full impact of Derek's words sank in. He was right. He didn't know where she lived, in a cheap apartment with inadequate security. He knew her schedule, her routes to and from work, probably knew more about her daily patterns than she was comfortable considering. The thought of him watching, cataloging her vulnerabilities, made her feel sick with fear and violation. "Thank you," she managed to say, though the words felt inadequate. Again, J1 studied her with the same penetrating attention he'd shown before, but now she understood he was cataloging signs of trauma, assessing the depth of her fear and the reality of her situation. "He's not going to stop," he said quietly, and it wasn't a question. Men like that, they escalate. They don't accept loss of control. Lila knew he was right. Derek's behavior had been growing more possessive and aggressive for months before their breakup, and tonight's confrontation showed he had no intention of respecting her decision to leave. If anything, her attempts at independence seemed to be inflaming his need to reassert dominance. "I can handle it," she said automatically, the response so practiced it came out without thought. "Can you?" J1 asked, his tone gentle but skeptical. "He knows where you live, knows your schedule, clearly has no respect for boundaries or public spaces. What's your plan when he decides to stop talking and start acting?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable because Lila had no plan beyond hoping Derek would eventually lose interest and move on. She had $4,200 saved, but that wasn't enough to disappear completely, wasn't enough to start over somewhere he couldn't find her. And even if she could manage to leave Seoul, Derek's threats suggested he would follow, would continue hunting her regardless of distance or time. "I don't know," she admitted quietly, the words feeling like a confession of defeat. J1 reached into his jacket again and withdrew the same simple black business card he'd offered 3 nights ago. This time when he held it out, she didn't hesitate to take it. "When you're ready to consider other options," he said, his voice carrying the same weight and certainty she remembered, "call me." "I meant what I said about having experience with situations like this." "What kind of experience?" she asked, though part of her suspected she didn't really want to know the answer. "The kind that ensures problems like Derek become permanently solved," he replied, his dark eyes holding hers with steady intensity. "I don't make promises I can't keep, Lila, and I don't let people hurt what's under my protection." The card felt warm in her palm, substantial and real in a way that Derek's threats had made everything else feel fragile and uncertain. She looked at the embossed silver numbers, then back at J1's face, trying to read the depths of what he was offering. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you help me?" "Because some things are worth protecting," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "And because I learned the hard way what happens when dangerous men are allowed to continue unchecked." Before she could ask what he meant by that, he was moving away, returning to his table to settle his bill with the same controlled precision that characterized all his actions. Lila stood watching him, the business card clutched in her trembling hand, understanding that she was holding more than just a phone number. She was holding a choice that could change everything, a decision that would determine whether she continued living in fear or stepped into something that might be far more dangerous than Derek, but could also be her salvation. Lila stared at the business card for 2 days before finding the courage to call. Derek had escalated exactly as J1 predicted. The first night after the restaurant confrontation, she'd returned to her small apartment to find her door unlocked. Nothing stolen, but everything subtly disturbed. Her clothes had been touched, moved, rearranged in ways that made it clear someone had been inside, searching through her private belongings with invasive thoroughness. The violation felt worse than theft, a psychological assault designed to strip away any sense of safety or privacy. The second night brought text messages every hour until dawn. Photos of her apartment building taken from across the street. Images of her walking to work, captured from angles that proved he'd been following her for days, maybe weeks. Each message carried the same underlying threat. "You can't hide from me. You belong to me. This game ends when I say it ends." By the third morning, Lila's hands were shaking so badly she could barely pour coffee. She'd gotten perhaps 6 hours of sleep in the past 2 days, jumping at every sound, checking locks obsessively, living in a constant state of hypervigilance that was wearing away her sanity like water eroding stone. When her phone rang with another unknown number, she nearly dropped it in terror before realizing Derek wouldn't call. He preferred the psychological torture of silent surveillance. "Hello," she answered, her voice barely steady. "Miss Chun." The voice was cultured, professional, unfamiliar. "Mr. Kim would like to invite you to lunch today, if you're available. 1 o'clock at the Millennium Seoul Hilton Executive Dining Room." Lila's heart hammered against her ribs. She hadn't called the number on the business card yet, hadn't even decided if she was going to. But somehow Jaewon knew she needed him. The thought that he was monitoring her situation, aware of Derek's escalating behavior, should have been terrifying. Instead, she felt the first spark of hope she'd experienced in days. "Tell Mr. Kim," she said carefully, "that I'll be there." The Millennium Seoul Hilton occupied an entire city block in the heart of Gangnam, its gleaming exterior reflecting wealth and power in every polished surface. The executive dining room was located on the 32nd floor, accessible only through a private elevator that required a special key card to operate. The space itself was intimate, designed for confidential business conversations, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Seoul's sprawling metropolis. Jaewon was already seated when she arrived, occupying a corner table that provided clear sight lines to all entrances while maintaining privacy from other diners. He wore a different suit today, midnight blue with subtle pinstripes, but the same aura of controlled power that made servers move with extra deference and caused conversations to drop to whispers in his vicinity. "Thank you for coming," he said as she settled into the chair across from him. "I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty of reaching out. Your situation seemed to require prompt attention." "How did you know?" she asked, though part of her suspected the answer. "I make it my business to know when people under my consideration are being threatened," he replied simply. Derek Morrison, 28, works construction when he can hold a job, has a history of domestic violence charges that were dropped when previous girlfriends declined to testify. He's been watching your apartment building for 3 days, following you to and from work, and last night, he gained access to your residence while you were working. The clinical recitation of facts she'd been trying not to think about made her feel simultaneously violated and relieved. Violated because it confirmed the extent of Derek's stalking, relieved because someone else finally understood the reality of her situation. "You had him investigated," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I had him researched," Jaewon corrected gently. "There's a difference. Investigation implies law enforcement involvement. Research is simply gathering information necessary to make informed decisions." "What kind of decisions?" Lila asked, though she suspected she was about to find out. Jaewon gestured to the server, who approached immediately with menus and water glasses, the kind of attentive service that spoke to either generous tipping or the kind of reputation that made people eager to please. After they'd ordered lunch that neither of them seemed particularly interested in eating, he leaned back in his chair and studied her face with the same penetrating attention she remembered from the restaurant. "I'm going to make you an offer," he said without preamble. "I want you to hear all of it before you respond." Lila nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. "I need a personal assistant for my legitimate business operations," Jaewon continued, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone conducting important negotiations. "Someone intelligent, discreet, capable of handling confidential information and high-pressure situations. Someone who speaks English fluently and can represent my interests at international business functions. The salary is $120,000 annually," he continued, watching her face for reaction. "Paid monthly, with bonuses for exceptional performance. I'll provide a furnished apartment in a secure building I own, utilities and security included. Complete medical and dental coverage. A clothing allowance appropriate for the social functions you'll attend as my representative." Lila's breath caught. $120,000 was more money than she'd ever imagined earning. More than enough to pay off her student loans, help her family back home, build the kind of financial security she'd only dreamed about. "The position requires absolute loyalty and complete discretion," Jaewon continued, his dark eyes never leaving her face. You'll have access to sensitive information about my business operations, both legitimate and otherwise. You'll meet people who value privacy above all else. You'll see and hear things that can never be discussed with anyone outside my organization. What kind of things? She asked quietly. The kind that keep people like Derek Morrison from becoming ongoing problems, he replied, his tone suggesting depths she didn't want to explore. I run several legitimate businesses, Lila. Real estate development, import-export operations, private security services. I also provide solutions for problems that traditional law enforcement can't or won't address. You're talking about illegal activities, she said, needing the confirmation even though she already knew. I'm talking about justice that operates outside conventional channels, he corrected. I'm talking about protection for people who have nowhere else to turn. The food arrived then, perfectly prepared dishes that neither of them touched, the conversation too important to interrupt with the pretense of casual dining. Lila stared at the untouched plate, her mind racing through implications and consequences. If you accept this position, J1 continued, you'll live in my building, work from my offices, travel with me when business requires it. You'll be under my protection 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In exchange, I expect complete honesty, unwavering loyalty, and absolute silence about anything you witness or overhear. What happens if I can't meet those expectations? She asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. Then you'll discover that my protection has limits, he replied simply. People who betray my trust tend to find themselves in very difficult situations very quickly. The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone he'd used to discuss salary and benefits, but the underlying menace was unmistakable. Jawan was offering her salvation, but it came with chains that might prove far more restrictive than Derek's possessiveness. You're asking me to become part of a criminal organization, she said, needing to voice the reality clearly. I'm asking you to accept a legitimate job that comes with certain additional protections, he corrected. The choice is yours, Lila. You can decline my offer and continue handling Derek Morrison through traditional channels. Hope that restraining orders and police reports will keep you safe. Or you can accept my proposal and never worry about him again. What would happen to Derek? She asked quietly. He would cease to be a problem, J1 replied, his tone suggesting finality that made her shiver. Permanently. Lila looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at Seoul's sprawling cityscape. Millions of people living their lives in blissful ignorance of conversations like this one, negotiations where protection was bartered for loyalty, and problems were solved through methods that existed outside legal boundaries. She thought about Derek's escalating threats, his invasion of her apartment, the photos proving he'd been stalking her with obsessive determination. Why me? She asked finally. You could hire anyone for this position. Why offer it to someone you barely know? Jawan was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his untouched coffee cup with methodical precision. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of memory that made her understand she was hearing something he rarely shared. I had a sister, he said quietly. Minjun. 3 years younger than me. Everything good and bright in a world that tends toward darkness. She was kind, trusting, saw the best in everyone she met. When I was building my organization, expanding my operations, focused entirely on acquiring power and influence, she met a man. Charming, attentive, everything she thought she wanted. He paused, his dark eyes distant with remembrance and regret. By the time I realized what he was doing to her, it was too late, he continued. The bruises, the isolation, the gradual destruction of everything that made her special. I was too busy with empire building to notice my sister was dying by degrees. When she finally tried to leave him, he killed her rather than let her go. Lila felt tears prick her eyes, understanding now why Jawan had intervened at the restaurant, why he'd researched Derek so thoroughly, why his offer of protection came with such deadly certainty. I built this organization to ensure nothing like that could happen again, he said, his voice steady despite the obvious pain of the memory. To provide the kind of protection that law enforcement can't or won't offer. But power without purpose is hollow, and I've discovered that protecting strangers doesn't heal the guilt of failing the person who mattered most. He looked directly at her then, his dark eyes holding depths of emotion she hadn't expected to see. You remind me of her, he said simply. Not physically, but in the way you carry yourself. Strength combined with vulnerability, determination despite fear. When I saw Derek grab you that first night, I saw my sister in that moment before everything went wrong. This time, I'm not too distracted to notice. This time, I can save someone. The admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch, more revealing than any business negotiation. Lila understood that J1's offer wasn't just about employment or protection, it was about redemption, about transforming his guilt into purpose through saving someone he'd been too late to help before. The terms are non-negotiable, he continued, his voice returning to business formality. You accept the position and everything it entails, or you decline and handle Derek Morrison through whatever means you think will be effective. But understand that men like him don't stop, Lila. They escalate until someone makes them stop permanently. She looked at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, thinking about the $4,200 she'd saved toward escape, money that would buy her perhaps 2 months of freedom before Derek tracked her down again. She thought about restraining orders that were just pieces of paper, police reports that documented abuse but rarely prevented it, a legal system designed to react to crimes rather than prevent them. She thought about Derek's text messages, his invasion of her apartment, the photos proving he'd been watching her with the patience of a predator. She thought about living in constant fear, looking over her shoulder for the rest of her life, wondering when his obsession would drive him to violence. Then she thought about J1's offer, the kind of security that came from aligning herself with someone who operated outside conventional boundaries, someone who solved problems through methods that guaranteed permanence. It meant accepting dirty money, becoming complicit in activities she couldn't fully understand, trading her moral certainty for physical safety. You're asking me to trade one form of control for another, she said quietly. I'm offering you the choice to trade victimhood for partnership, he corrected. To stop running and start building something that Derek Morrison can never touch. What's the timeline for decision? She asked, though part of her already knew what her answer would be. 24 hours, he replied. After that, my offer expires, and you'll need to handle your situation through whatever alternative means you think will be effective. Lila closed her eyes, weighing freedom against security, independence against protection, moral certainty against survival. When she opened them, J1 was watching her with patient intensity, a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, but willing to wait for her to recognize that what he wanted was also what she needed. If I accept, she said carefully, Derek disappears permanently. He ceases to be a factor in your life, J1 confirmed. You'll never see him again, never receive another threatening message, never have to look over your shoulder wondering when he might appear. And in exchange, I become part of your organization, she continued, working through the implications. I handle legitimate business, but I also become complicit in whatever methods you use to solve problems. You become protected, he corrected gently. Everything else is just the mechanism that makes protection possible. Lila stared out at Seoul's skyline again, at the city where she'd come to start fresh and build a new life, only to find herself trapped by the same patterns of control and violence she'd thought she was escaping. Derek would never stop, she understood that now. He would follow her across continents if necessary, would escalate his threats until someone made him stop permanently. I accept, she said, the words feeling both like surrender and liberation. I accept your offer, Mr. Kim. J1's expression shifted slightly, satisfaction mixing with something that might have been relief. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a sleek smartphone, still in its original packaging, and placed it on the table between them. Your new number, he said simply. The old one will be disconnected this afternoon. Derek Morrison will find himself unable to contact you through any electronic means. Your belongings will be moved to your new apartment tonight. By tomorrow morning, your previous life will be completely severed from your new one. Just like that, Lila thought, understanding that she was witnessing the efficiency that came from unlimited resources and complete disregard for conventional limitations. In 24 hours, she would be someone else entirely, protected by someone who treated problems like Derek as minor administrative details to be resolved quickly and permanently. The apartment J1 provided occupied the entire 38th floor of a gleaming residential tower in Gangnam, the kind of building where security required 3 different access cards and facial recognition technology to reach the residential levels. Lila stood in the massive living room, taking in floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of Seoul's sprawling cityscape. Minimalist furniture that probably cost more than she'd ever earned in a year, and artwork that belonged in museums rather than private residences. Everything was pristine, elegant, and utterly unlike any space she'd ever called home. The kitchen featured professional-grade appliances she didn't know how to operate. The master bedroom was larger than her previous entire apartment, and the bathroom included amenities she'd only seen in luxury hotels. It was beautiful, sophisticated, and completely overwhelming in its demonstration of wealth that existed on a scale she'd never imagined. "Your belongings have been placed in the bedroom," Jae-won said, observing her stunned reaction with patient amusement. "The building's security team has your photograph and instructions that you're to receive complete cooperation with any requests. Your previous apartment has been cleaned out and the lease terminated. Derek Morrison will find no trace of your former residence." Just like that, Lila thought, her old life erased as efficiently as deleting a computer file. She should feel relieved, liberated from the constant fear that had dominated her existence for months. Instead, she felt unmoored, set adrift from everything familiar and deposited into a world where her monthly rent had probably been someone's daily wine budget. The first 2 weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and learning. Jae-won maintained offices on the 15th floor of the same building, legitimate spaces where he conducted the legal aspects of his business empire. Real estate development, import and export operations, private consulting services that catered to Seoul's wealthiest families. Lila's days were filled with managing schedules, translating documents between English and Korean, preparing reports that dealt with property acquisitions and international shipping contracts. She proved surprisingly capable at the work, her attention to detail and natural efficiency earning approving nods from Jae-won and respectful treatment from his other employees. The legitimate side of his operations was complex but comprehensible, dealing with millions of dollars in transactions, but conducted through perfectly legal channels. If she ignored the occasional hushed phone conversations in rapid Korean, the visitors who arrived without appointments and departed looking either relieved or terrified, she could almost pretend she worked for a conventional businessman. The evenings were more complicated. Jae-won maintained a routine of dining at home rather than restaurants, preferring the privacy and security of his own space to the exposure of public venues. He extended daily invitations for Lila to join him, requests that felt like gentle commands given their circumstances. She found herself accepting more often than declining, drawn by curiosity about this man who could eliminate threats with casual efficiency while demonstrating unexpected domesticity in his private moments. He cooked, which surprised her. Not elaborate meals that required professional training, but competent preparation of simple dishes that spoke to someone who valued self-sufficiency over convenience. She would sit at the kitchen island while he worked, initially uncomfortable with the intimacy of the setting, but gradually growing accustomed to the quiet companionship of shared space. "You don't have to keep inviting me," she said one evening during their 3rd week, watching him prepare vegetables with the same methodical precision he applied to business negotiations. "I can eat in my apartment. I know I don't have to," he replied without looking up from his cutting board. "I choose to. There's a difference." "Why?" she asked, the question that had been building since she'd accepted his proposition. "Why does it matter to you whether I eat alone or with company?" Jae-won paused in his chopping, his dark eyes meeting hers with the directness she'd grown accustomed to but still found unsettling. "Because isolation is another form of imprisonment," he said simply. "You've spent months living in fear, disconnected from normal human interaction. I don't want my protection to become another kind of cage." The consideration behind his words surprised her. She'd expected efficiency, security, the clinical provision of safety without regard for her emotional well-being. Instead, she was discovering thoughtfulness that seemed genuine, attention to details of her comfort that went beyond contractual obligations. Their conversations during these shared meals gradually deepened from business necessities to personal observations, carefully neutral topics that revealed aspects of their personalities without venturing into truly intimate territory. She learned that he read voraciously, favored historical biographies and classical literature, over contemporary fiction. He discovered her passion for art, her abandoned dreams of studying painting before financial necessity had forced more practical career choices. It was during the fourth week that the walls between them began to crack. Lila was working late in the office, finishing a translation project that required completion before morning meetings, when Derek's attempts to contact her escalated beyond electronic harassment. Her old phone number had been disconnected, her social media accounts deleted, her previous apartment scrubbed of any forwarding information. But Derek had always been resourceful when his obsessions demanded satisfaction. The building's security called J1 at nearly midnight. Derek had appeared at the main entrance, demanding to see Lila, claiming to be her husband with legal rights to know her whereabouts. When informed that no resident by her name existed in the building, he'd become increasingly agitated, eventually requiring police intervention to remove him from the property. J1 found Lila in the office, staring at security footage on his computer screen that showed Derek pacing outside the building's entrance like a caged predator, his behavior erratic enough to concern trained security professionals who dealt with wealthy people's eccentricities on a daily basis. "He's not going to stop," she said quietly, her voice hollow with the recognition of something she'd been trying not to acknowledge. "Even with all this security, all these precautions, he's still trying to find me." "No," J1 agreed, settling into the chair beside her with the controlled grace that characterized all his movements. "He's not. Men like Derek Morrison don't accept loss of control. They escalate until someone makes them stop permanently." "What happens now?" Lila asked, though part of her suspected she already knew the answer. "Now he's made this personal," J1 replied, his voice taking on the cold precision she'd heard when he discussed eliminating problems. "He's demonstrated that he's willing to compromise your security despite clear warnings to maintain distance. That level of persistent threat requires a permanent solution." "You're going to kill him," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I'm going to ensure he never threatens you again," he corrected gently. "The specific methods aren't something you need to concern yourself with." Lila turned away from the security footage, unable to continue watching Derek's agitated pacing, his obvious desperation and rage. Part of her felt sick at the thought of his death, even knowing what he was capable of, even understanding that he would never stop hunting her. Another part of her felt relief, so profound it frightened her. The recognition that J1 was offering the kind of permanent solution that would allow her to sleep without terror for the first time in months. "Why does this bother you?" J1 asked quietly, observing her internal struggle with patient attention. "He's threatened you, stalked you, violated your privacy, and demonstrated complete disregard for your safety. You know he'll escalate until someone stops him permanently." "Because I'm not a killer," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because accepting that someone has to die so I can feel safe makes me complicit in his murder." "You're not killing anyone," J1 said, his tone surprisingly gentle. "You're accepting protection from someone who has the resources and willingness to eliminate threats that conventional law enforcement can't touch. Derek Morrison chose this path when he decided that your autonomy was negotiable." He leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes distant with memory, and Lila sensed that he was about to share something significant, something that would shift the foundation of their relationship. "Minjun tried to leave him 3 times, he said quietly, his voice carrying pain that 5 years hadn't diminished. "Each time, Lee Dong-soo found her, convinced her to return with promises to change, threats about what would happen if she didn't come back willingly. The police treated it as a domestic dispute, beyond their jurisdiction unless actual violence occurred." He paused, his hands folded with controlled precision, but Lila could see the tension in his shoulders, the way old guilt still caused physical stress despite years of processing. "The 3rd time she left, he followed her to our mother's house," he continued, his tone remaining steady through obvious effort. "Broke down the door, killed our mother for hiding Minjun, then shot my sister twice in the chest before turning the gun on himself. By the time I arrived, it was over. 3 people dead because I believed law enforcement could handle a situation they were never equipped to address." Lila felt tears sting her eyes, understanding now the depth of J1's guilt and the source of his ruthless approach to protecting people who reminded him of his lost sister. His criminal empire wasn't built purely on greed or power hunger. It was constructed on the recognition that sometimes justice required operating outside legal boundaries. "I'm sorry," she said, the words feeling inadequate for such profound loss. "I'm so sorry that happened to your family." "Don't be sorry," he replied, meeting her eyes with steady intensity. "Learn from it. Understand that Derek Morrison is Lee Dong-soo with a different name, the same obsessive need to control, the same willingness to escalate to violence when control is threatened. The only difference is that this time, someone is prepared to stop him before he can destroy everything you care about." The weight of his words settled between them, along with the recognition that their relationship had shifted from business arrangement to something far more personal. Jae-won wasn't just protecting a valuable employee, he was preventing history from repeating itself, using his resources to save someone he'd been powerless to help when it mattered most. "What if I said I couldn't live with knowing Derek was killed because of me?" Lila asked quietly. "What if I asked you to find another solution? Then I'd respect your choice and arrange for Derek Morrison to disappear instead of dying." Jae-won replied without hesitation. He'd wake up in a location where continuing to search for you would be impossible, with sufficient motivation to start a new life far from Seoul. It would be more expensive and complex than permanent elimination, but it would accomplish the same goal. "You'd do that?" she asked, surprised by his willingness to accommodate her moral concerns. "Even though killing him would be simpler." "I'd do whatever allows you to sleep peacefully," he said, his voice carrying conviction that made her understand this wasn't just about protecting her physical safety. "I've seen what living with guilt does to people. I won't be responsible for burdening you with knowledge you can't bear." "Thank you," she said softly, though the words couldn't adequately express her gratitude for his consideration, for treating her conscience as something worthy of respect rather than an inconvenient obstacle to efficient problem-solving. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching Seoul's lights twinkle through the office windows, both understanding that something fundamental had changed between them. What had begun as a business arrangement was evolving into something deeper, built on shared trauma and mutual protection rather than simple financial exchange. "Get some rest," Jae-won said eventually, standing with the fluid motion that made him seem dangerous even in peaceful moments. "Derek Morrison will be handled tomorrow, one way or another. After that, you'll be able to move through the world without looking over your shoulder, without fear of unexpected encounters or threatening messages." "And then what?" Lila asked, though she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. "Then we see what kind of life you want to build when safety isn't a constant concern," he replied, his dark eyes holding depths of possibility she was only beginning to recognize. "Then we discover who you become when protection isn't something you have to earn or bargain for, but something you simply possess." As she rode the elevator to her apartment, Lil found herself thinking not about Derek's impending disappearance or the methods Jae-won would use to ensure her safety, but about the quiet intimacy of shared meals, the unexpected consideration he showed for her moral struggles, the way he'd transformed from intimidating stranger to someone she trusted with her life, and increasingly with her heart. Derek's behavior spiraled into desperation over the next week, his attempts to locate Lila becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous. The building's security reported 3 more incidents, each escalating from the last. First, he'd tried to bribe a maintenance worker for information about recent move-ins. Then he'd attempted to follow a delivery truck into the underground garage. Finally, he'd been caught trying to scale the building's exterior wall, apparently believing he could somehow reach her apartment through a combination of determination and reckless disregard for gravity. Jae-won reviewed the security footage with clinical detachment, but Lila could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when Derek's face appeared on the monitors. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was escalating towards something far more dangerous. "He's involving other people now," Jae-won said quietly, his voice carrying implications that made her stomach clench with anxiety. "Men who smell weakness, who see opportunity in someone else's desperation." "What kind of men?" Lila asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "The kind who solve problems for people who can't handle them alone," he replied, his dark eyes meeting hers with steady intensity. "Derek Morrison has gambling debts, according to my sources. Significant ones. The kind that make people consider desperate solutions when conventional options run out." Lila's blood ran cold. She'd known about Derek's gambling, The poker games that lasted until dawn, the sports betting that consumed increasingly large portions of his paycheck. But she'd never considered that his losses might have reached the level where dangerous people would demand payment, where her location might become valuable currency in settling debts. "You think he's told them about me?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think Derek Morrison is a desperate man who believes you're his property, worth enough to settle his obligations," J1 replied with brutal honesty. "And I think the people he owes money to are very interested in discussing alternative payment arrangements." The confirmation of her worst fears hit like a physical blow. Derek wasn't just stalking her out of obsession anymore. He was hunting her as a commodity, something to be traded for his own safety. The thought of being reduced to a bargaining chip in someone else's financial crisis made her feel sick with revulsion and terror. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Despite J1's comprehensive security measures, Derek had found a way to reach her again. The message contained a single photograph, taken from across the street as she'd left the building that morning. But this time Derek wasn't alone in the image. 4 other men stood with him, their faces partially obscured but their postures radiating menace that was visible even through a cell phone camera. The accompanying text was brief and terrifying in its simplicity. "Tonight, one way or another." J1 read the message over her shoulder, his expression shifting from concern to the cold fury she'd seen when he discussed permanent solutions to persistent problems. He immediately began making phone calls in rapid Korean, his tone carrying authority that made people jump to attention even through electronic connections. "You're not leaving this building until this is resolved," he said after ending his third call in as many minutes. "Derek Morrison has just escalated from harassment to credible threat with criminal accomplices." "What are you going to do?" Lila asked, watching him activate security protocols that seemed designed for warfare rather than residential protection. "I'm going to ensure that Derek Morrison and his associates understand the consequences of threatening people under my protection," he replied, his voice carrying deadly certainty. "This ends tonight." But Lila's day proceeded normally despite the underlying tension. Meetings with architects about a new development project, conference calls with shipping companies about import schedules, the mundane business of running legitimate enterprises that generated millions in annual revenue. She tried to focus on translation work, on preparing reports that required her complete attention, but anxiety made concentration nearly impossible. It was nearly 6 o'clock when building security called with urgent news. Derek and his associates were no longer maintaining distant surveillance. They'd moved closer, were now positioned at strategic points around the building's perimeter, clearly preparing for some kind of direct action. J1 reviewed the new security footage with expressions that grew progressively darker. 5 men now, all carrying the kind of concealed weapons that spoke to serious intent rather than simple intimidation. They moved with coordination that suggested planning, preparation, the kind of tactical thinking that made this far more dangerous than desperate improvisation. "They're going to try to take you when you leave the building," he said, his tone matter-of-fact despite the gravity of the situation. "Tonight, tomorrow, whenever they think they have the best chance of success." "Then I don't leave the building," Lila replied. But even as she spoke the words, she understood how naive they sounded. These men weren't going to wait patiently for her to emerge. They would find ways to force the issue, to create situations where hiding behind security wasn't possible. "They'll escalate until you have no choice," J1 agreed, confirming her fears. "Building maintenance emergencies, fire alarms, bomb threats, whatever it takes to force evacuation. Men like this don't give up when conventional approaches fail." As if summoned by his words, the building's fire alarm system activated with piercing electronic shrieking that made rational thought nearly impossible. Emergency lighting engaged, elevators shut down automatically, and recorded announcements began instructing all residents to evacuate immediately using designated stairwells. J1's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted into combat readiness that made Lila understand this wasn't a coincidence or system malfunction. Derek and his associates had found a way to force her into the open, to strip away the security that had kept her safe for weeks. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice cutting through the alarm's wailing. "Do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you to do it." They joined the stream of residents moving toward the emergency stairwells, But Lila could see J1's security team positioning themselves strategically throughout the evacuation routes. Men in expensive suits who moved like soldiers, their attention focused on potential threats rather than the supposed emergency that had triggered this exodus. The descent to street level felt endless. 38 flights of stairs filled with confused residents and the persistent scream of emergency alarms. Lila's heart hammered against her ribs with each step, her hands trembling as adrenaline flooded her system in response to danger she couldn't yet see but knew was waiting. They emerged onto the street to find chaos that looked like genuine emergency response but felt orchestrated for maximum confusion. Fire trucks, police vehicles, emergency personnel directing crowds away from the building while maintaining perimeters that would facilitate Derek's plan rather than prevent it. Lila scanned the crowd of evacuated residents, looking for threats among the faces of people she'd grown accustomed to seeing in elevators and lobbies. That was when she spotted them. Derek and 4 other men, positioned at strategic points around the emergency perimeter, moving through the crowd with predatory intent that made her blood turn to ice. They weren't trying to hide anymore. Derek's face was visible, focused entirely on her with obsessive intensity that made her understand he was beyond rational thought now, driven by desperation and the kind of rage that made violence inevitable. She instinctively moved closer to J1, but even as she did, she realized the crowd was working against them. Too many people, too much confusion, too many opportunities for Derek's associates to get close before security could react. That was when everything went wrong. The first man approached from her left, dressed like emergency personnel, but moving with aggressive purpose that had nothing to do with evacuation assistance. J1 saw him coming, intercepted him with efficient violence that was over before most people realized it had begun, but the attack was a distraction for the real threat. Derek appeared directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the desperate rage in his eyes, the way weeks of frustration had twisted his features into something barely recognizable as the man she'd once thought she loved. "Time to come home, baby," he said, his hand reaching for her arm with the casual possessiveness that had once made her feel special and now made her skin crawl with revulsion. Lila jerked backward, but Derek's reflexes were faster, his fingers closing around her wrist with brutal force that sent pain shooting through her arm. Around them, the crowd continued their evacuation procedures, most people too focused on their own concerns to notice the drama unfolding in their midst. "You're coming with me," Derek continued, his voice carrying the edge of someone who had committed completely to a course of action that allowed no alternatives. Right now, willing or not. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened until she gasped involuntarily, pain making her vision blur as he began pulling her toward a van that had appeared at the edge of the emergency perimeter. Through the chaos, she could see J1 fighting his way toward them, but 3 men were blocking his path, creating enough interference to give Derek the time he needed. "Help," she tried to shout, but her voice was lost in the noise of emergency vehicles and crowd chatter, her plea disappearing into urban chaos that provided perfect cover for abduction. Derek dragged her another 10 feet toward the waiting vehicle, his associates moving to surround them in a formation that would prevent intervention until it was too late. Lila's heart hammered frantically against her ribs as she realized how perfectly they'd planned this, how completely they'd anticipated and neutralized the security measures that were supposed to keep her safe. This was it. Derek was going to succeed in taking her, would use her as payment for his gambling debts, or worse, would ensure she disappeared completely rather than risk her escaping again. All of J1's resources, all his promises of protection, were about to prove inadequate against desperate men with nothing left to lose. Then gunfire erupted. Not the dramatic explosions of movie violence, but the sharp crack of professional weapons used by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Derek's associates dropped with clinical precision, eliminated by marksmen she hadn't even seen positioning themselves throughout the crowd. Derek himself froze, his grip on her wrist loosening as he realized his carefully planned abduction had just collapsed into lethal chaos. Around them, emergency personnel began moving with different purpose, revealing themselves as J1's security team rather than genuine first responders. "Let her go," J1's voice cut through the confusion with absolute authority, and when Lila turned toward the sound, She saw him approaching with a gun drawn and an expression that promised Derek's death if he didn't comply immediately. Derek's hand fell away from her wrist as if burned, his face cycling through confusion, rage, and growing terror as he began to understand the scope of what he'd attempted and how comprehensively he'd failed. "You don't know who you're fucking with," Derek said, but his voice carried none of its earlier confidence, replaced by the desperate bravado of someone who realized he was about to die. "Actually," J1 replied, his tone conversational despite the weapon in his hand, "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. The question is whether you're smart enough to walk away while that option still exists." Derek looked around at the bodies of his associates, at the security team that had materialized from apparent nowhere, at the realization that his desperate gamble had not only failed, but had likely signed his own death warrant. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction, sounded more like hopeful thinking than credible threat. "Yes," J1 replied with absolute finality, "it is." Derek turned and ran, disappearing into the crowd with the panicked desperation of someone who understood he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. Lila watched him go, knowing she would never see him again, understanding that J1's people would find him before morning and ensure he never threatened anyone again. She stood in the aftermath of violence, surrounded by emergency vehicles that weren't quite what they seemed and personnel who'd been protecting her rather than responding to genuine crisis, her hands shaking with adrenaline and the recognition of how close she'd come to disappearing forever. "It's over," J1 said softly, his weapon disappearing as quickly as it had appeared, his attention now focused entirely on her well-being rather than tactical considerations. "You're safe." Lila looked at him. This dangerous man who'd orchestrated an elaborate deception to protect her, who'd positioned his people throughout an evacuation crowd to ensure Derek's plan would fail, who'd been willing to kill multiple people rather than let her be taken. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate for what he'd just done, for the level of protection he'd provided without her even realizing the depth of planning involved. "Come home," he said gently, his hand offering support rather than control as he guided her away from the scene. "Let me take care of you." And for the first time since accepting his proposition, Lila understood that home wasn't a place anymore. It was standing beside someone who would move heaven and earth to keep her safe. Someone who'd proven that his promises weren't just words, but commitments backed by unlimited resources and unwavering determination. As they walked away from the chaos, she realized her feelings had shifted completely. What had begun as gratitude for protection had evolved into something far deeper, something that felt like love for a man who'd shown her what safety truly meant. The next morning brought confirmation that Derek Morrison's chapter in Lila's life had closed permanently. J1 received the call at 7:30, his voice remaining neutral as he listened to reports delivered in rapid Korean, but Lila could see satisfaction in his dark eyes when he ended the conversation. Derek and his surviving associate had been located attempting to flee Seoul through Incheon Airport. They would not be making their intended flight, or any future flights for that matter. "It's finished," he said simply, settling beside her on the penthouse terrace where she'd been watching sunrise paint Seoul's skyline in shades of gold and amber. "Derek Morrison is no longer a factor in your life, or anyone else's." Lila felt a complex mixture of relief and something that might have been grief, not for Derek specifically, but for the loss of her own innocence, the recognition that her safety had required someone's death. She understood it had been necessary, that Derek's escalation would have continued until someone stopped him permanently, but accepting that reality still felt like crossing a moral line she could never uncross. "How do you live with it?" she asked quietly, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that provided warmth against the morning chill. "Knowing that people die because of decisions you make." Jaewon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on Seoul's sprawling metropolis rather than her face, and she sensed he was considering how much truth she was prepared to handle. "By remembering that the alternative is worse," he said finally. "Derek Morrison would have killed you eventually, Lila. If not directly, then through selling you to people who view human beings as disposable commodities. Every day he remained alive was another day of threat to your safety, another opportunity for him to destroy someone else the way Lee Dong-soo destroyed my family." He turned to face her then, his dark eyes holding depths of conviction that made her understand this wasn't rationalization, but hard-won wisdom. I don't take lives lightly, he continued, his voice carrying weight of experience and carefully maintained principles. But I learned the cost of hesitation when it comes to protecting people who matter. Minjun died because I believed in legal solutions to illegal problems, because I thought dangerous men would respond to conventional boundaries. I won't make that mistake again. The admission hung between them, laden with years of guilt and the determination that had shaped his approach to protection ever since. Lila began to understand that Jae-won's criminal empire wasn't built on greed or power hunger alone, but on the recognition that sometimes justice required operating outside legal frameworks that protected perpetrators more effectively than victims. "Thank you," she said softly, the words carrying weight beyond gratitude for immediate safety. "Thank you for being willing to cross lines I couldn't cross myself." They sat in comfortable silence as Seoul awakened around them, traffic beginning to flow through streets that wound between glass towers and traditional buildings. Millions of people starting their day in blissful ignorance of the violence that had ensured one woman's freedom during the dark hours before dawn. Over the following weeks, Lila found herself settling into a routine that felt increasingly natural despite its luxury and underlying complexity. Her work with Jae-won's legitimate businesses expanded as her competence became apparent, managing international transactions and client relationships that dealt with millions of dollars in completely legal commerce. The criminal aspects of his operations remained largely invisible to her, handled through separate channels that protected her from direct involvement while allowing her to understand the source of their security. But it was the personal aspects of their relationship that underwent the most dramatic transformation. Shared meals became expected rather than optional, comfortable domesticity that revealed unexpected facets of Jae-won's personality. He possessed dry humor that emerged during quiet conversations, demonstrated surprising knowledge about art and literature, showed genuine interest in her opinions about everything from business strategy to interior decoration choices for the building's common areas. She began to notice small considerations that went beyond professional courtesy or contractual obligations. Her favorite coffee appeared without request. Books she'd mentioned wanting to read materialized on her desk. The apartment's temperature was adjusted to her preferences without her ever mentioning comfort levels. These gestures suggested attention to her well-being that felt personal rather than simply efficient management of a valuable asset. 3 months after Derek's elimination, Lila realized she was no longer thinking about her arrangement with Jae-won as temporary expedient or necessary evil. Somewhere during the gradual building of trust and intimacy, her feelings had evolved from grateful acceptance to genuine affection, then from affection to something much deeper and more complicated. She was falling in love with him. The recognition came during an evening when they'd been reviewing contracts for a new development project. Jae-won explaining complex financing structures with the same patience he'd shown when teaching her to operate the apartment's sophisticated security systems. His hands moved with precise grace as he illustrated points on architectural drawings, his voice carrying authority tempered by consideration for her learning process. When he looked up from the documents to gauge her understanding, their eyes met with sudden intensity that made her breath catch. The professional distance they'd maintained despite their growing closeness suddenly felt artificial, unnecessary barrier between two people who'd been circling around deeper connection for months. "Lila," he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones that made her understand he'd noticed the shift in her attention. "Is there something you want to ask me?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that could change everything or nothing depending on her response. She could retreat to safe professional territory, maintain the boundaries that had kept their relationship clearly defined despite its underlying complexities. Or she could acknowledge what had been building between them, risk the security she'd found by reaching for something that might prove far more valuable or completely destructive. "I want to know if this arrangement has become something more for you," she said, her voice steadier than she'd expected despite the magnitude of what she was risking. "Because it has for me." Jae-won set down the documents he'd been holding, his complete attention focused on her face with intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and cherished. When he spoke, his voice carried emotion she'd never heard from him before, vulnerability that transformed his usual controlled demeanor into something entirely human. "Lila," he said, reaching across the space between them to touch her hand with gentle precision. This stopped being just an arrangement for me the night you accepted my protection. Maybe before that, when I first saw Derek Morrison put his hands on you and recognized something in your eyes that reminded me of everything I'd failed to save. His fingers intertwined with hers. Contact that felt electric despite its simplicity. Physical connection that seemed to complete a circuit that had been building charge for months. I told myself I was protecting you because of Minjun, because you represented a second chance to do what I'd been too late to do for my sister. But that was only part of the truth, and I've been lying to myself about the rest. What's the rest? She asked, though her heart was already racing with anticipation of his answer. The rest is that you've become essential to me in ways that have nothing to do with guilt or redemption. You make this dark world bearable. When I come home, and you're here, when we share meals and conversation and comfortable silence, I remember there's more to existence than power and protection and the endless calculation of threats. He lifted their joined hands, pressing her knuckles to his lips with reverent gentleness that made her understand the depth of emotion he'd been carefully controlling. I love you, he said simply, the words carrying absolute conviction despite their quiet delivery. I love your strength, your kindness, your willingness to see humanity in someone whose hands are stained with choices most people couldn't live with. I love the way you make me feel like I might be worth saving despite everything I've done. The confession hit her like physical impact, stealing her breath and sending her heart into frantic rhythm that made speech momentarily impossible. She'd hoped he cared for her, suspected his attention went beyond professional interest, but hearing explicit declaration of love from someone who chose words with such careful precision felt like receiving something precious beyond measure. I love you too, she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion she'd been carrying for weeks without fully acknowledging. I know what you are, what you do, the darkness you live in. And I love you anyway. Maybe because of it. Because you use that darkness to protect people who have nowhere else to turn. Jaewon's expression shifted into something she'd never seen before, relief and gratitude and desire combining into a look that made her understand how carefully he'd been guarding his own heart, how much courage her acceptance required from someone who'd lost everyone he'd ever loved. He stood from his chair and moved around the table to where she sat, his hands gentle as he helped her to her feet, bringing them close enough that she could see gold flecks in his dark eyes, could breathe the subtle scent of expensive cologne that had become synonymous with safety and home. You're mine, he said, his voice carrying possessive intensity that should have alarmed her, but instead sent warmth flooding through her entire body. You belong to me now, completely and permanently. I will never let anything hurt you again. The declaration was delivered with absolute conviction, claim of ownership that acknowledged no possibility of negotiation or future change. Anyone else making such statement might have triggered her flight instincts, reminded her too much of Derek's controlling obsession. But coming from Jaewon, the words felt like promise rather than threat, commitment rather than possession. And you're mine, she replied, her hands reaching up to frame his face with touching that felt both tender and claiming. Broken pieces, dangerous choices, and all. You belong to me too. His smile then was like sunrise, transforming his features from controlled intensity to something approaching joy. Emotion she'd never seen him display and understood few people were privileged to witness. Marry me, he said, the proposal delivered with same directness he brought to business negotiations, but his voice carried vulnerability that made it plea rather than demand. Be my wife officially, permanently, legally. Let me give you everything I have, everything I am. Yes, Lila said without hesitation, understanding that she was accepting far more than marriage proposal. She was choosing to permanently align herself with someone whose protection came with moral complexities she was still learning to navigate. But she was also choosing love over safety, connection over independence, partnership with someone who'd proven his devotion through actions rather than just words. Jaewon's hands moved to cup her face with reverent gentleness, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones as if memorizing texture and warmth that he'd been afraid to claim but no longer needed to resist. I have resources that most people can only imagine, he said softly, his eyes holding hers with steady intensity. Money, property, influence that spans multiple countries and industries. But none of it means anything without someone to share it with. Someone who makes accumulating power feel like preparation for protecting what matters rather than ends in themselves. He leaned closer, their foreheads touching an intimacy that felt more profound than any physical passion, connection of minds and hearts that promised partnership rather than simple attraction. I'll build you a life so safe, so secure, so protected that you'll never have to look over your shoulder again, he continued, his voice carrying weight of absolute commitment. No one will ever threaten you, hurt you, or make you afraid. You'll have everything you've ever dreamed of and security to enjoy it without fear. What I want, Lila said softly, her hands moving to rest against his chest, where she could feel steady heartbeat that anchored her to this moment, this choice. This man who transformed from dangerous stranger to beloved partner is a life with you. Everything else is just decoration. He kissed her then, contact that began gentle and deepened into passion that spoke to months of careful control finally released, desire that had been building beneath professional boundaries and emotional walls now free to express itself completely. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, his dark eyes held promise of future intimacy that would match the emotional connection they'd finally acknowledged. Over the following months, as wedding preparations proceeded with efficiency that spoke to unlimited resources and careful attention to every detail, Lila found herself marveling at the transformation of her circumstances. A year ago, she'd been a frightened woman trapped by an abusive relationship, counting dollars toward escape fund that might have bought temporary freedom but never permanent safety. Now she stood in penthouse that overlooked Seoul's glittering skyline, wearing engagement ring that probably cost more than most people earned in lifetime, planning marriage to man whose love had proven itself through actions rather than words, whose protection extended to every aspect of her existence. The ceremony itself was small, intimate gathering of people who mattered to Jae-won rather than elaborate social display. His business associates, the few family members who'd survived various conflicts, employees who'd earned his trust through years of loyal service. Lila wore dress that cost more than her previous year's rent, but what made her feel beautiful was way Jae-won looked at her, as if she were precious beyond measure rather than simply elegant. When they exchanged vows, his voice carried emotion that made several hardened criminals in attendance blink back tears they'd never admit to shedding. She promised to love him despite the darkness he carried, to be partner rather than burden, to build life together that honored both their pasts and their hopes for future. He promised to protect her with everything he possessed, to love her beyond reason or safety, to ensure she never again knew fear or want or loneliness. When he slipped wedding band onto her finger, the weight of it felt like anchor rather than chain, symbol of belonging that she'd chosen rather than trap she'd fallen into. Their honeymoon was spent at private estate he owned on Jeju Island, secluded compound where security was invisible but comprehensive, where they could simply be together without performing roles or maintaining professional boundaries. She learned that Jae-won possessed unexpected tenderness, patience with her inexperience that spoke to consideration she'd never expected from someone so accustomed to taking what he wanted. But more importantly, she discovered that love could exist alongside moral complexity, that accepting someone completely meant embracing both their capacity for protection and their willingness to destroy threats that endangered what they valued. Jae-won would always be dangerous, would always operate outside conventional moral boundaries when necessary, but his darkness served purpose of preserving light rather than extinguishing it. 6 months after their wedding, as they shared breakfast on the penthouse terrace while Seoul awakened below them, Lila reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate waitress fleeing abusive relationship to beloved wife of one of Korea's most powerful men. She'd walked into that upscale restaurant with bruises hidden under makeup and fear as constant companion, saving every dollar toward escape that might have lasted months before Derek tracked her down again. She'd walked out with dangerous man's complete devotion and future so secure, so protected, that threat itself had become foreign concept. Any regrets? Jae-won asked, following her gaze across Seoul's sprawling landscape, reading her contemplative mood with accuracy born of intimate knowledge. None, she replied honestly, her hand finding his across the small table where they'd shared countless conversations, countless quiet moments that had built foundations stronger than passion or convenience. I wouldn't change anything, even knowing the cost. Even knowing what had to happen to Derek and his associates. She continued, meeting his eyes with steady gaze that acknowledged difficult truths without flinching. Even knowing what you do to protect what's yours. I understand now that some choices can't be made through conventional morality. Jae-won's expression softened, understanding and gratitude combining into a look that made her feel cherished beyond measure. He'd been prepared to love her despite her moral objections to his methods. But her complete acceptance of who he was and what he did had given him peace he'd never expected to find. "I love you, Mrs. Kim," he said, using married name that still sent warmth through her entire body 6 months after ceremony. "I love your strength, your acceptance, your willingness to build life with someone whose hands will never be completely clean. I love you too," she replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "All of you, darkness and light both." They sat in comfortable silence as morning progressed around them, two people who'd found in each other exactly what they'd needed despite never knowing to look for it. Lila had found protection that went beyond physical safety to encompass emotional security she'd never imagined possible. Jae-won had found purpose beyond power, love that transformed his criminal empire from cold business calculation into fortress built around something precious worth defending. Below them, Seoul continued its daily rhythm of millions of people pursuing their dreams and fears, unaware that high above their concerns, two people had discovered that love could flourish even in darkness, that protection and devotion could create light strong enough to illuminate any shadow. That afternoon brought news that one of Derek's former gambling associates had been asking questions about Lila's disappearance, apparently believing she might be valuable enough to pursue despite Derek's fate, serving as warning about consequences of such interest. The problem was resolved by evening. Jae-won never told her the details, and she never asked. Some knowledge was burden she didn't need to carry, trust that extended to accepting his judgment about what threats required attention and what methods best ensured their permanent elimination. She was no longer the frightened woman who'd flinched when Derek appeared at her workplace, who'd hidden bruises under makeup and counted dollars toward uncertain escape. She was Kim Jae-won's beloved wife, protected by resources that spanned continents and loyalty that had proven itself through blood when necessary. And by nightfall, every threat had been eliminated once again, just as her husband had promised on their wedding day. Nothing would ever threaten their family, their peace, their carefully constructed sanctuary in a world that had once seemed determined to destroy her. She was finally, completely, eternally safe.